Spine-tingling horror goodness but plagued with glitches and bugs. Set in Kowloon Walled City, you're a private investigator searching for your auntie who worked to rehabilitate heroin addicts but got involved with a strange cult and has since gone missing. Phantasmal is self-described as a survival horror roguelike, which for some reason is also included as part of the title on Steam. It has all the usual traits which define a modern-day roguelike, i.e. it has procedurally generated levels and a permadeath system, and gathers its horror elements from the likes of Amnesia with an emphasis on the sanity of the protagonist. Essentially, they've tried to gather all of the most popular genres in recent years together to try and appeal to as many crowds as possible. I was attracted to this game in the first place as it seemed to have quite a strong focus on melee fighting and grappling with the lower echelons of society in a similar vein to Condemned. Fortunately, this aspect is almost as good as I had hoped. The impact of the attacks feels weighty and for the most part you're struggling to find enough weaponry to defend yourself. This amplifies the horror and makes every situation feel that little bit more desperate and can result in you taking the decision to just try and leg it. But it isn't perfect. The range on the melee weaponry isn't exactly obvious and it's quite difficult to judge, and the guns let off huge amounts of smoke which obscure your vision. There are also methods built in to avoid their combat completely, such as throwing out flares to pull the creatures out of position and let you slip through. It doesn't always quite work quite as you might expect, as they often get stuck in door frames and end up attracting the spooks and addicts directly to you, and other times if you just happen to be standing in the wrong place they'll walk directly at you anyway. The monster design itself is relatively standard stuff, with spiders, shadow men and the junkies which inhabit the rehab centre, as well as a few more on top of this. They keep it interesting by making them interact with the player in different ways and having different roaming patterns. One of my favourites is a set of eyes which follow your flashlight and stand directly in your eye line to gradually degrade your sanity until you're completely defenceless, and then they strike. Several recent games have taken the fighting option completely out and rely on the player hiding away until the danger is gone, but Phantasmal really offers you a range of options when it comes to confronting the monsters, and this is probably its strongest point. Graphically it isn't exactly the prettiest, but with horror games it tends not to matter too much, and in cases like this it can actually make the environments more intimidating. There are several effects which did little more than irritate me, as they lasted too long and hindered the vision to the point where I couldn't see anything. It's difficult to feel threatened when you can't tell what is happening. I'm also not convinced by a number of the sounds used to make it scarier, particularly the sound boxes which occur relatively often and have very poor sound quality. It doesn't make them intimidating, instead it just makes them unpleasant to be around. The gamma setup test when I booted up the game seemed to lead me astray, as the bright areas were unbearable, and after a while I actually opted to turn it down further, but the contrast in some areas was just difficult to look at. The procedurally generated levels are created by using a set of building blocks to produce a supposedly unique experience every time, but the chunks used are quite large and repeat relatively often. I'm not sure why, but the number of double elevator sections also confused me, as they just didn't seem to make sense, and it could have been easily avoided by just stopping two identical areas being linked. The movement through some of the rooms is quite difficult because they are packed full of chairs and tables to obscure your path through, which do work in some situations to make it more desperate, but you often get caught between the legs and have to spend several seconds jumping up and down on the spot and hitting objects to try and escape their clutches. In my opinion, the story aspect of the game loses its effectiveness due to replaying the same section and encountering the same lines over and over again. Horror tends to rely on the mystery to drive the character onwards and try and resolve the situation, but if you hear the same part repeated it quickly loses its significance. But the game really falls down on its stability. Almost every time I stopped playing was because the game had crashed and I couldn't be bothered to load it back up again. The longest run I had without a crash was around 45 minutes, and when it struck right in the middle of a particularly good run, it was infuriating, especially when the game is generally quite difficult. And the physics engine also isn't exactly reliable, as sometimes when you kill a monster it goes flying through the environment, taking all possible immersion with it. This all damages the experience to the point where I couldn't actually recommend this game as such, because it makes it very difficult to play. Which is very disappointing as it shows so much promise, and when it works it's excellent, and succeeds in keeping you on the edge of your seat every step of the way. Despite the fact that it recently came out of early access, I would still say that it looks very much in development. The creators are still active on the forums and frequently talk through issues and release updates. It is entirely possible that in the near future Phantasmal becomes stable, but until then there are far better, more complete horror games out there. If you are willing to wade your way through the glitches and bugs, however, it is an excellent experience.